Hello and welcome to NDTV Profit. You're joining us on this special broadcast where we're actually talking about a very crucial issue that affects India's nuclear power ambitions. Now, India's nuclear power ambitions have set a new set of backers coming in, and that is the private sector. While delivering her budget speech in February, the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman had spoken about a proposal to allow the private sector to participate in the efforts that India has. By 2033, India plans to have 5 small and modular reactors with the private sector. This is to aid India's plan to have 100 gigawatt of nuclear power capacity by 2047. Already, the Nuclear Power Corp of India, the Corporation of India, has sought bids from private players to set up 2 small reactors of about 220 megawatt electrical each. The response to this bid has actually been very strong. Leading private players like Adani Group, Reliance Group and L&T have all expressed their immense interest in participating in this entire process. The Finance Minister has, of course, also spoken about the changes to the Atomic Energy Act and the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act to boost these efforts. Our guest on today's show, who is Vinayak Chatterjee from Infravision Foundation, he has estimated in a recent column that the private sector could contribute about 50% of India's nuclear power needs in the coming few years. And I want to welcome Mr. Chatterjee to this conversation. Mr. Chatterjee, welcome. I want to first start off this conversation with this 50% number. Now, I know that you were quoting the NPCIL chief when you said that, but how do you see this playing out?
You know, this is a very important shall I say, point of inflection for India's power sector. And I want to step back for a minute to just share a statistic with your viewers, is that in France, 70% of French energy needs are from nuclear. Now just think about that. Whereas in India, only 2% of our capacity is nuclear. France has gone overboard in terms of relying its dependence on fossil fuel from a strategy that they unleashed in the 1970s to reduce the dependence on fossil fuel. And I think in many senses, India has lost a fairly large number of years, because I would say that we've probably lost, close to 75 years, because the nuclear program was envisaged and unveiled by Dr. Homi Bhabha in the 1950s. And since then, it has kind of been sputtering, with the net effect that we've got only 8.8 gigawatts out of our 400 gigawatts installed capacity. But now, what you just said is that there seems to be a fresh reawakening that nuclear power is going to be a very important portion of our energy basket. For a variety of reasons. Obviously, it is to reduce dependence on hydrocarbons. It is to meet our clean energy commitments of net zero by 2070. And also to, in a sense, look at not the complete dominance of the sector by the public sector, but to allow private sector to come in with the view till 2047, as you just said, that was announced, to have private sector contribute about 50% of the envisioned capacity of 100 gigawatts. 50% will be private sector, but through a very important technology, not heavy-duty large plants of 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts, but a series of small, what is called SMR, small module reactors, which are anywhere around 300 to 400 megawatts. They unlike the large atomic energy generation plants that need to be set up in situ, means assembled at site, these can be like turbines and generators. These can be factory made and assembled at sites. It could be an industrial cluster, it could be a refinery, it could be a city to supply. So it's a completely different way of looking at nuclear energy for 2 reasons. For 3 actually. 1, to consider it as an important element in the overall basket, to have private sector do about 50% of it, and 3, to use this SMR technology, which is safer, factory produced, and in smaller modules in a largely dispersed manner. But over to you.
Let me break this conversation down into multiple pieces then. The first one, which you said that we've lost about 75 years in developing our own sort of nuclear power capacity. I just wanted to get a sense of what the legislative part of the story has looked like over these last years. And of course, then what the public sector has achieved in all of these years of attempting to develop a strong flow of nuclear power.
Look, why wouldn't blame the public sector for lack of, shall we say, the state of our small capacity today? Because remember, nuclear power is an extremely, or has been an extremely closely held technology by the superpowers. And they have been very, very reluctant over the decades to supply, the fuel, nuclear fuel, uranium and other derivatives to India because of the fear that India would develop, nuclear armament capabilities. That has always been the fear. And therefore, there have been a whole lot of restrictions where the Atomic Energy Club has been a very closed club with all kinds of barriers to entry. And India suffered because of that, because of our neutrality, because of our, non-alignment, etc., etc. So the fact that Dr. Homi Bhabha's vision could not be fully unveiled was, I suspect, a creature of geopolitics and the fact that it was a closely held technology in a closed club. But that's about to change right now. That's the hope, right? So over to you.
Mr. Chatterjee, I wanted to pick your brain a little bit and try and explain to me a little bit about what is it that you are looking forward to at this point in time. Yes, the private sector is slowly coming in. NPCI is opening up certain bids for these SMRs or small module reactors that you spoke about earlier, inviting private sector participation in developing them. But at what pace do you think this is going to grow? Because the ask is 50 gigawatt, because 50% of 100 gigawatt, that's what we're talking about, by 2047, which is just about 22 years away. How do we reach that number with the current level of private sector participation?
See, it would be to open up the field to a large number of investors, right? But there are two impediments, and you touched upon them in your opening remarks. The first is the Nuclear Liability Act, which was kind of signed off during the famous Dr. Manmohan Singh's signing of the Civil Nuclear Act with USA in 2005, which also was a seminal step, but it then kind of lost momentum after that, where we signed the Civil Nuclear Liability Act, where India was fairly, was fairly adamant that the nuclear liability, should any accident happen, would remain with the suppliers. In essence, there are many other bells and whistles in that, but this was the fundamental point. And since then, suppliers, like major suppliers like Westinghouse, like Hitachi, like Areva of France, have been extremely cagey about participating, because they said, look, after we have supplied the equipment, for the next infinite number of years, we can't be held responsible for any misdeeds that may happen in the operating style, which may lead to an accident or a leak or anything of the sort. So the Nuclear Liability Act was, looking back, quite harsh and prevented the rapid development of the sector even after signing the act in 2005 with USA, Civil Nuclear Act. So one of the ideas now is to reduce the liability clause to make it far more practical, to share the risk between the equipment supplier, the operator, and the conditions thereof, and the harshness of it. That's point one. Point number two is to actually make, for, since we are now expecting the private sector to contribute 50% of the capital. Remember, nuclear power is capex intensive and is therefore, in many senses, unviable. The capex could be, anywhere which 4 to 6 times the capex required to produce the same unit of electricity, whether it's renewable or coal thermal. Now, if you have to get private sector in, then you have to look at incentive packages like viability gap funding. For example, let's take a look at semiconductors. In semiconductors, the Tata Group is investing 90,000 crores for, obviously, a proud investment for India to take our march into semiconductors at Dholera and Gujarat. But it is getting a 70% fiscal support, often called viability gap support. 50% is from the center and 20% is from the state of Gujarat. So 70% of 90,000 crores semiconductor investment is taken care of by the state to encourage the sector. Now, it's extremely important that we encourage the nuclear sector, and therefore, options like viability gap funding, like fiscal support, soft loans, all of these need to be welded into a package to make it not just attractive for the private sector, because attractive is an interesting word, but to actually make it viable for the private sector to enter nuclear power production. That is point number two. And point number three is that currently the private sector believes that even operating the plants after putting the capex is subject to many restrictions, that the plant will be operated by people who are employees of National Power Corporation, or that they will be in charge of many aspects of operations, and that private sector will only put in the capex and take the market risk. Now, this is the current set of perceptions, and these perceptions require to be handled, and therefore the exact nature of the public-private partnership is still work in progress. But I am told that the government is alive to the fact that it needs to balance private sector interest, enthusiasm with the necessary regulatory safeguards and come up with a package that is a win-win for all players, including the citizens of India. But over to you.
If you were in charge of developing these amendments to the Atomic Energy Act or the Civil Liability Act, I'm trying to understand what specific changes would you recommend if this was a decision that laid with Vinayak Chatterjee?
I would find it difficult to answer the question because it involves extremely scientific and technical details which are beyond my pay grade, to be frank with you. I know the issues, but it is actually, the subject is extremely technical, and therefore I will not be able to give you the exact contours.
Fair enough, Mr. Chatterjee. I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned the cost aspect of it. Of course, the numbers that we have, and these are numbers largely provided by you, about 16 to 20 crore per megawatt. That's the capital cost of setting up a nuclear power plant, power project, versus coal, which is about 9 to 10 crore, and solar, which is even less, at about 4.5 to 5.5 odd crore. I wanted to get a sense of, is this a situation where higher volumes means lower costs? So therefore, as the expansion happens, as more and more capacity comes in, you will find it cheaper to then develop more future capacities?
It's a difficult question to answer. I will draw a parallel situation with hydropower. Hydropower is very capex heavy because you have to build huge dams and catchment areas and all kinds of stuff. But over the life of the first 5-6 years of a hydro project always look unviable in a feasibility report, because you got to service the capital, etc., with very heavy capex in the first years. But the beauty of hydro projects is that the raw material is virtually free. In a sense, it's water flowing down. So the balance years of a hydro plant make it an extremely profitable venture. But the first 6-7 years have to be taken care of by having a long tail, where large part of the financial, servicing the financial burden has to be pushed to the longer end of the tail. Similarly, nuclear is very capex heavy, but going forward, it is expected, with the nature of the costing of the fuel supplies, which will be government controlled, it is expected to have far lower operating cost. So the balance between high capex and lower operating cost on a running basis has to be handled in a similar to the challenge handled in hydro. But all said and done, even if that is done, there is no question that it will require various kinds of capital servicing, capital subsidy, as well as soft loans, as well as a long tail to service the capex. And that should be one of the critical financial issues that the government has to address. But as I said, the government is alive to such issues, and the semiconductor example makes the point.
Okay, I want to touch upon the status of infra development in India in general, and we'll add nuclear development on top of that. To your mind, what are the specific sort of efficiencies that a private sector player brings in? Because we've had about 70 odd years, 50 odd years of private sector players coming in and starting to build projects en masse, and especially over the last 30 odd years. How do you see the efficiencies that a private sector contractor, private sector builder can bring in. And here we are talking about names which are, Adani Group, Reliance Group, L&T, who are all given the sort of title of being India's biggest builders, right? How do you see the efficiencies coming in then?
Look, this is an easy question to answer. I mean, there has always been the question of why PPP? Why do you want private sector in the infrastructure sector? It's not just about money, it's about bringing in efficiencies. So why I'm saying it's easy for me to answer this question is you just have to look around you. What was telecom before private sector came in? What was the state of our airports before GMR, GVK, Adani came in? What was the pace of implementation of power projects before the biggies came in? How much has the distribution increased, the efficiency increased in Mumbai and Delhi and many other cities when distribution was thrown open from the moribund state electricity board and discoms to the private sector? So the answer is today not a theoretical question anymore, that why should private sector come? Just look around you and you will see the kind of modernism, efficiency, service level that private sector brings in. Not just capital, although bringing in capital is an important point, because if you notice that in the last union budget, the growth in the union budget, the growth in infra spends has plateaued. It has just been an increase from around 10.2 to about 11.1, so it's plateaued. So, and the FM is concerned about meeting her fiscal deficit targets, which are tough. And therefore, to build infrastructure in the country, obviously the capital from the private sector is important, and not just from domestic capital. Please remember that foreign capital, long-term pension funds, insurance funds, etc., are very bullish on investing in Indian operating brownfield assets. So, and so therefore, look around you, and the answer is clear.
Yeah. Then I want to add a point to this. So then, are we to think of newer styles of financing these projects? Because as you said, they are nuclear power projects are significantly capex heavy. You would have to think about it differently than what you would look at a conventional power plant as such.
See, let me give you one extreme example, and that's not a private sector example. Sure. Look at the financial structure of the bullet train. Japan through JICA has given 60-year money at 0.5% interest with a moratorium of 15 years. Now, just think about it. Think about that capital structure which enables a high capex bullet train project to be developed by a developing country like India. Now, I'm not saying you need that level of, shall I say, an extreme financing structure, which is very welcome. But if the state were to bundle a financial plan and then have and give it, and package it for, let's say, Japanese or Nordic or Gulf sovereign funds, and the government of India stood as sovereign guarantor to them and has a package which is long, low interest, high moratorium, and then distributed that finance to the developers of nuclear energy. Those are the kind of steps I'm looking at, that the state must be a partner, not just in creating an appropriate regulation, not just in supplying of regular fuel assurance at appropriate prices, but also to create a financial structure based on the strength of the Indian state and the confidence that people have that India never defaults, to stand as a sovereign guarantor to a very long-tailed, cheap finance available in a holistic manner, a line of credit, which it then cuts and makes available to the chosen developers of nuclear power. Those are the kind of thoughts that's going through my mind.
I want to ask you last couple of questions. Now, there is talk about allowing, considerable foreign direct investment. Of course, there's no confirmed news at this point in time. We don't have confirmations on this. But news reports have suggested a 49% FDI might be allowed for nuclear power projects. Is that kind of, when you say foreign capital is needed to develop these capacities in India, is that the kind of push that you're expecting?
Well, it's one of the elements. Allowing 49% is safe, 51% remains with Indian players. But remember, we ultimately, while we are developing SMRs with NPCL technology and our own initiatives, a wide variety of dependence will be there on foreign equipment suppliers. And there are just a handful of them. As I mentioned, there is Westinghouse, there is Hitachi GE, there is Areva, etc., etc. But giving 49% not only gets the capital in, but also gets the expertise in building and running these plants. and that would be welcome. And we have a case of 100% FDI. If you take the new airport outside Delhi at Jewar, it's 100% FDI by Zurich Airport. Bangalore Airport is owned also by largely with FDI, with Mr. Prem Vatsa's investment. So we have reached a stage where large portions of Indian infrastructure have welcomed coal thermal plants. We have foreign players who have invested. So giving 49% is logical, both from the view of attracting capital as well as from the fact of accessing technology and competence.
One last actually, two more questions, but one question specifically, because the current geopolitical situation is sort of, talking about a nuclear power nation, which is being accused of, developing weapons-grade nuclear power. What I wanted to understand is, in case there is some kind of geopolitical tension, what happens then? Does the presence of the private sector, does the involvement of the private sector sort of take away that kind of negative view around nuclear power?
I suppose so. I mean, as I started your session by saying, 70% of France's energy is nuclear. Does that mean that all of us are extremely wary about France as a nuclear power? No, we aren't. Because the uses of nuclear technology for civil nuclear power are vastly different from its usage in military applications. And you cannot deny the fact that across countries in the world, many countries have a high percentage of their energy needs coming from nuclear. So to my mind, they are in two separate bins. And I don't think that India increasing its share of nuclear would largely create any fright in the rest of the world, because India is considered a very mature player in this regard.
And my last question then is the energy transition goal that India has. Now, of course, I mean, everybody, including the government, has specifically said that this 100 gigawatt target that they're talking about, 2047, that is going to be crucial as part of India's goal to have a more sustainable energy source in the future. To your mind, what is then the goal once you have achieved that? What do you go for next?
Well, actually, 2047 is not the real goal. 2047 is fine for a target that we've got to get 100 gigawatt of nuclear by 2047. The real goal, the committed goal by India is at COP26 in Glasgow, where we said that we would be a net zero nation by 2070. And that is a tough target, because we have that many years to add all kinds of non-fossil fuels, whether it's solar, wind, tidal, geothermal, nuclear, all kinds of and hydropower. All of these have to be added as non-fossil sources of power to enable India to be net zero. So nuclear is with 100 gigawatts target by 2047. Hopefully by 2070, we will not only be 100 gigawatts, but we'll be 200 gigawatts. That or more, that would be a very important element of driving India's commitment to be net zero by 2070. So nuclear has a very major role to play.
All right, Mr. Chatterjee, thank you so much for taking time out and talking to us about these different aspects about nuclear power and India's ambitions, as well as, of course, the private sector push that's coming in. That was Vinayak Chatterjee from Infravision Foundation joining us on this conversation, especially to talk about nuclear power. What is he saying? Well, essentially 100 gigawatts by 2047 is a great target to have, but the goal, the eventual goal, is to be net zero on the power side by 2070. So this will aid in that entire journey. That's it from me right now. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay tuned to NDTV Profit for more news and updates.